Hello and welcome to Useless Movie Reviews. You know, it's been a couple of 100 years since I was living in the 1800s, but I liked it a lot. A simpler time where psychiatry was in its infancy and I didn't have to wear a straitjacket all the time. So when I feel the nostalgia swelling, I like to nose my way through my video collection to bite out a copy of The Time Machine, a movie that can still be enjoyed today. Made in the 60s about a time traveller from the 1800s that travelled through the early 1900s and beyond to end up far in the future, only to return briefly back to travel into the future again. Come to think of it, I think this movie might be the reason why I have to wear this straitjacket today, but I digress. Now, it was often cold in the 1800s because climate change scientists hadn't faked all that warming data yet. And it's here we meet our protagonist's best friend Philby, who has arrived to tonight's dinner soiree a little bit late, but I don't judge. Fanny, the housemaid, doesn't seem to mind though. She's a little sweet on him, I think. And thanking Mrs. Licker for helping him derobe, he enters the waiting room where Dusty, Frank and Billy are waiting to become ZZ Top, and are also waiting for a free feed. This was before they did car and hooker commercials though. They are no sooner seated at the dining room table and boasting about how many songs they downloaded from Napster this week, when the door is flung open and their dishevelled host staggers in demanding spirits. I once did this for fun, but the Pope wasn't impressed and set a gaggle of bishops on my ass. I learned my lesson that day, I can tell you, and couldn't sit down for a week, but enough about incest. I should really get back to the movie. After the one with the beard demands answers, he starts to regale them with his fanciful story, starting last week when they were all present, so didn't really need the story to start there, because they already knew that bit. Anyway, the week before, when they were in his waiting room discussing the novel idea of minimalising their lives, George explained he had made a time machine, which could send all their useless crap into the future, where they didn't have to give a shit anymore. And he demonstrated this by breaking a cigar, explaining it was now useless, and sending it off to 1987, where Arnold Schwarzenegger found it and used it in 3 movies. It was here they suggested that if he built a bigger one, perhaps they could get rid of some more shit, like all those clocks on the walls. And George agreed to being paid to build a bigger one at once. Later that day, taking a breather from his work, he stared out his front door and wondered if his time would be better spent building a bricks and mortar style asylum instead of watching the mobile asylums do the rounds. Maybe one day, he thought, those poor Rothschilds will get the help they dearly need. But after shaking off his melancholy, he goes into the lab and decides to test the time machine himself before filling it full of clocks and ZZ Top members, which is coincidentally what inspired Back to the Future 3. Anyway, he starts off slow in case something goes wrong, but soon speeds up because of the seizure-inducing special effects, and then faster and faster he goes, far into the future. The house is gone, molten rock covers where it once stood, and still on he goes, waiting for the rock to be worn down by the elements, so he might stop and get out for a stroll. Just then, he lights a match to check his name is still etched into the console. It can't be to see anything else as it's all backlit, so he's being a bit self-indulgent, and suddenly it's free again. He stops the machine to check on this new time, and goes off for a stroll and a piss. Not long after, he hears laughter, and finds a clearing containing a group of Hitler Youth. Seeing one having a swim, he decides he might like a dip himself, and it's not long before they're both exhausted. Back at their communal pad, he tries to spark up a conversation to learn more about them while he mooches their food. He finds out they did away with government and laws, and live a free and happy life until the Morlocks eat them, and they even have a library. Thinking he may get more sense out of the Morlocks, he finds out they live underground and is soon off to investigate. The underground caverns in which they live are full of wondrous props and people's bones, but it's not so bad. That is, until he sees hideous Morlocks herding the simpletons like sheep to the slaughter. Being a strict vegan, he realizes he'll never be able to relate to this advanced civilization and decides that killing all the meat eaters is the only sane thing to do. And so, in true vegan fashion, after a little bit of genocide, he decides to go home to tell his friends the story and heads back to the time machine. When he gets to where he left it, he sees it's been jacked by the remaining Morlocks to set a trap, and he jumps inside to beat them by going back to his own time. Suckers. And so here he was, late for dinner. But at least he could pass on any mutated strains of future pathogens to his pals back home. And so it's only left for him to shove a baby Triffid into his mate Philby's hand to show he cares, make sure the others get dropped off in the mobile asylum before they breathe a word of it, and get back to his new friends in the future. The film ends with Philby explaining through exposition that it appears he's dragged the time machine back to his workshop, so he'll be outside the Morlock camp this time when he goes back, where his new friends are now waiting in the future. But it's likely he will now materialize right on top of them and probably kill them instantly, so they'd better move out of this space quick smart in case he changes his mind again and comes back in his blood and brain covered chariot. Damn right, says Mrs. Licker, I ain't cleaning up that shit like I did for Burke and Hare until that tight git pays up what he owes me. It ain't worth it. Philby can't help but agree. The end. Thanks for making it to the end of this ridiculous pile of tot. Do join me again in the future for another steaming pile of useless movie review by pressing that darned elusive subscribe button somewhere hereabouts. Until then, remember, if someone you don't know sits down close to you and you just look at them and say, well, 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 you've just gained the upper hand for a few seconds. Cheerio.